Hello and welcome to another episode of Latitude. The Indian Ocean is perhaps the world's busiest and most important trade route. It's made up of more than 20 countries that have access to the Indian Ocean region, and the volume of both maritime and energy trade that takes place in the Indian Ocean is something which is now being taken very seriously. And to look at the several dimensions that concern the Indian Ocean, both strategically and more importantly, the historical factors where the Indian Ocean was one area of the world where there were enormous cultural linkages and also trade linkages, we have two experts. We have Mr. Sanjaya, who is eminent author of best-selling works on Indian Ocean, as well as an economist of repute. And we have Dr. Sanjay Baru, distinguished journalist, former media advisor to the Prime Minister of India, and well-respected expert on strategic affairs, currently distinguished fellow at the USI, Delhi. Dr. Baru, my first question to you is, the Indian Ocean's importance in the last several years has really gone up in terms of the strategic value that the region has. What are the key issues that now dominate the narrative of Indian Ocean?
Well, I think the rise of the Indian Ocean as an important theater of activity, economic and activity and security concern, is linked to the shift in the global economy, the center of gravity of the global economy, away from the west to the east, and the rise of Asia as the center of gravity of the global economy. The 20th century was a century in which the Atlantic and then the Pacific dominated global commerce and also global security concerns. I mean, the First World War, the Second World War were fought in the Atlantic and then in the Pacific. But the Indian Ocean has become today the most important crossroads of the flow of energy, flow of commodities, flow of people, because of the rise of Asia and the growing commerce between Asia and Europe, Asia and Africa, and also Asia and Latin America, that a lot of it goes through the Indian Ocean.
Right. Interestingly, there is a point that sometimes made, Sanjeev, in the debates, is that if you look at the Pacific, it has a very distinct American shadow there. And you look at Indian Ocean, it has traditionally had a British shadow. Most of the countries there play cricket, I'm told. But more importantly, your book does talk about how historically there was this great spillover of Indian culture amongst the Indian Ocean nations, and the fact that there was a trade connectivity which went well beyond the current figures where we are talking of 40 to 50% of the world maritime trade taking place through this maritime route. So would you like to elaborate on that?
So yes, I mean, the Indian Ocean has been an arena of human civilization and trade from the very beginning, from the Bronze Age. I mean, the Harappans were trading with the Sumerians, and right through to through the medieval period, where India had enormous trade links, cultural links with Southeast Asia. So these links are very, very deep, and they have been going back and forth. It's not just that, India was culturally colonizing the rest of this region. We were enormously influenced by Southeast Asia, the Arabs, and so on. So this is a ecosystem of give and take. It's a very old ecosystem. Remember that the so-called discovery of America is an unintended consequence of trying to find a way to India and the Indian Ocean. So this is a very old ecosystem. And as Dr. Baru just pointed out, except for the part of the 19th century and the 20th century, this has been the hub of human activity for a very long time. And after a long time, it's back, so to speak.
Okay. Dr. Baru, sir, it's said that something close to about 50% of the world's maritime oil trade takes place through the Indian Ocean region right now, and 40% or so of the world's offshore petroleum again is found in and around the Indian Ocean, quite clearly making it very important for India and its energy security needs. But not just India. I mean, the route from the Gulf countries south of India through the Straits of Malacca are even of considerable concern to a country like China, which is quite clearly the elephant in the room as far as Indian Ocean is concerned. What are your thoughts on that?
Absolutely. And you know, the significance of this is actually going to increase because the West is becoming, particularly the United States, is becoming energy self-sufficient. The discovery of shale gas and other resources, the Canadian natural gas and petroleum, the American continent is becoming increasingly self-sufficient in energy. Europe depends largely on Russia. It is the East Asian economies, China, South Korea, Japan, Southeast Asia, and of course India. It is we who are going to be increasingly dependent on West Asian, what we call West Asian or Middle Eastern sources of energy. And all of that energy, whether it's gas or petroleum, will move through the Indian Ocean, either to India or east of India. And therefore, the security of the maritime security and the assurance of energy flows, India will increasingly play an important role in ensuring the security of the Indian Ocean.
Yeah, and so has India been asserting on the security dimension. But Sanjeev, again, back to you on the economics, since you are an economist also substanding. The economics of the Indian Ocean region, can it take place effectively and trade without ensuring the security? Because one of the factors that emerges in much of the discourse that is happening is that countries want to prosper and do trade, but do not want to address the primary security threat in the region, coming out as it is with China's muscle flexing.
So one of the things you've got to realize that China has done this in the past as well. So this is not the first time that China has moved into this region. If you go back to the 15th century, Admiral Zheng He came with his treasure fleet and did the same thing. So you know, well before the Europeans, it was the Chinese who had come to this region. So this kind of muscle flexing and rivalry has been going on for literally thousands of years. So this is not a new thing. What is key here to understand is that the most important lesson of history is that flexibility and stamina always beat brute strength. So as far as India is concerned, and our own role in this is that we need to be very, very flexible in the way we approach this. But the most important thing we need to do first, before we even go down that path, is that India needs to get out of thinking of its history as a landlocked history. We tend to have a history of, think of history in a very Delhi-centric way. But if you think of our maritime history, then our neighbors are not, you know, China and Pakistan only. It's also Indonesia. It's also Singapore, with whom we have very, very close and very old links. I mean, after all, Indonesia became free. It named itself Indonesia. Its currency is called the rupiah. Its you know, national airline is called Garuda after Vishnu's eagle. So these are links which we Indians do not actually take advantage of. Whereas in Southeast Asia, or for that matter in Oman, there is a very positive and very deep cultural link and a good historical link on which we Indians simply do not pay any attention.
Dr. Barusa, Sanjeev just talked about the need for understanding history to set out the contours of the future relationships. There is also a great deal, and it's been for a long time, in terms of the countries in Southeast Asia wanting India to play a bigger role. How do you feel the current Indian government decision to act east as against the look east, which was there for several years, is dipped as an initiative?
Well, first of all, I'd like to emphasize the fact that the understanding of the history of the Indian Ocean is important for us in India. Because as Sanjeev said, our entire history teaching has been so land-oriented. You know, we only think of the Mughals and the British. The fact is that India has had this deep intercourse with the Indian Ocean region. And so when we talk of history, it is meant to remind ourselves of that history. Because when you come to the region, I think very few people are interested in history. You know, there's no point coming to Indonesia and talking about history. I think in Indonesia, people ask the question that you're asking, what are you doing today? You know, in what way will India convert its look east into act east? And the most important measure of that would be trade. increasing trade, increasing economic intercourse. So the geoeconomics of the Indian Ocean, which is the growing economic interaction between India and the region, is the first more important step that we needed to take, and we have taken. If you look at the numbers, more than 50% of India's trade till the end of the 20th century was with the West, with Europe and the US. More than 50% of India's trade today, at the end of one decade of the 21st century, is with Asia, and mostly with Indian Ocean countries. So that is the first step in activities that we have already taken. But the next step is really investment flows, more open economy, much greater tourist interaction. I mean, India gets so few tourists from Southeast Asia and from East Asia. But that means improving infrastructure at home, making it easier for people to come home.
Right. Sanjeev, a quick question. We always look at Indian Ocean in terms of either Southeast Asian countries, in India we look at it that way, or, at most, the Gulf countries.
Yes.
But there is the African element and the shores of Africa and its impact on Indian history. Can you throw a bit of light on that?
Of course, as a species, we all come from Africa, and we have had a very long and old interaction with them. Gandhiji, became a political activist in Africa. There is still a very substantial Indian community all scattered along the East African coast. And historically, we actually have a lot of trade. Even today, we already have a lot of trade. So I think we are simply not leveraging these linkages. And of course, you have to remember that in many ways, these countries are at a level of economic development where the products we produce are very much attuned to the requirements of those countries. So in some ways, these are ready markets. We are exploiting it to some extent, but again,
we need to do more.
But we need to do much, much more.
Okay, we'll be back after a break to look at India, the strategic challenges that India faces in the Indian Ocean region, and what could be New Delhi's responses. Welcome back. We have our two distinguished guests still with us looking at the Indian Ocean region. Dr. Baru sir, there are more than 20 countries that make up the Indian Ocean region. We have never really gone the whole hog in exploiting the goodwill that exists for India, whether in Southeast Asia or in other parts of the Arabian Sea that leads on to the Indian Ocean. Are we going to be looking at purely a passive approach, or are we willing, or do you see New Delhi raising the stakes in terms of countering the aggressive activities, particularly of countries of China, like China, which have entered the Indian Ocean region under the pretext of anti-piracy operations, but clearly their agenda is bigger?
Well, first of all, I would say that, in the last 10 years, 10, 15 years, there is a recognition in India of the importance, the strategic importance of the Indian Ocean. The most important evidence of that is the increasing budget for the Indian Navy. Through the 50s, 60s, 70s, and even 80s, we neglected the Indian Navy. When we thought of defense, we thought only of the army and then the air force, because our conflict was with Pakistan and with China. But in the last 10, 15 years, if you see the Indian defense strategy, the Navy has become increasingly important. We already have a couple of aircraft carriers. We're planning to acquire more. We have submarines. We have naval bases. We have a base in Mauritius. We have acquired bases in Africa, in Southeast Asia. We do maritime exercises with Oman, with Malaysia, with Indonesia, with Japan, with Australia. So, there's an across-the-board increase in the strategic engagement of the Indian Ocean. And the tsunami was a turning point when suddenly the Indian Navy became such an important factor in dealing with a major crisis. But subsequently, even the piracy activity, whether it was Korean ships, North Korean ships in the Arabian Sea, or the other pirate activity along the East African coast, I think India has now come up as a major player.
Right. Sanjeev, Dr. Baru referred to building of ports. And within that, there is, of course, the Sagarmala initiative of the Modi government. But there is also the initiative to try and revive some of the trade links and the ports that were there historically there. So we're not just talking of history, and we're not trying to re-educate ourselves, but we're trying to use history to leverage our new initiatives in the region on the basis of historical links. Your thoughts?
I think we need to be less apologetic about our approach. So the game here is that, Indian approach has by and large been extremely apologetic. We seem to be reactive to the thing. Now, what we don't want to do is to rush in and begin doing too many things. But yes, we need to sustain certain initiative. We have obviously gone into Chabahar. But again, remember, we went there as a response to Gwadar. Whereas this is an activity we should have thought about and pursued anyway. The same thing, of course, with the port activities in Sri Lanka, for example. Again, we more or less wake up when China does something. So I think we've got to stop doing that, stop reacting. We do need to have a presence in all these countries. Incidentally, most of these countries are very happy to have us there. In many cases, particularly in Southeast Asia, as a counterbalance in some cases, but in some cases purely for trade and investment, just as a commercial activity. So stop being apologetic, but yes, in those things that we do, we have to dig in to be able to sustain it. Because nothing worse than rushing in, doing 20, promising 20 things and not delivering on half of them, because one of the major problems that India has is that of a reputation of not delivering the goods in the end. Talking a lot and not delivering. So we have to deliver a few good projects, good initiatives, and deliver it down to the last T.
Interesting points. Dr. Baru, in terms of Chabahar, I think we've strategically, clearly taken bold steps. But there is also a view that we've been reluctant to move in some of the areas where opportunities were offered to us. Sri Lanka, the port in Hambantota, and there are arguments and counter-arguments given about that. Getting more involved in Myanmar, again, hesitant steps, but now the steps have been taken. There is also the need for India to provide a counter to some of China's aggressive maritime activities, which China likes to project as trade activities, or the Chinese increasing muscle flexing in the South China Sea. Where do you think these strategic initiatives are taking us, and do we have the United States as one possible country which is wanting to work with us in these areas?
Talking about hesitation, I think the famous phrase now that Prime Minister Modi has popularized is hesitations of history in the case of the Indo-US relationship. The original hesitation in the Indian Ocean region, from a strategic point of view, was actually Gwadar. Gwadar was offered to India by Oman because it was a British principality or British territory. And when Oman became independent, Gwadar belonged to Oman. And Oman offered Gwadar to India. But we said, what is going to do in this corner of Baluchistan, this useless area? What a short-sighted view. And that is how Gwadar went to Pakistan. I think that kind of short-term thinking is over. I think the one thing that has happened over the last couple of decades in India is there is increasing long-term thinking. And the reason for the revival of interest in Chabahar is not just because of Gwadar now. It's really linked to the Chinese One Belt, One Road. That China is building these linkages across the Eurasian landmass. I think we have woken up to the fact that many of these linkages were actually centered around India. India was the crossroads of Asia, both land-based crossroads and sea-based crossroads. Trade from across Asia used to go through India. In fact, a lot of it Sanjeev has referred to in his book on the churn of the Indian Ocean. And I think the important thing today is that we recognize that Pakistan has cut off the land links between India and the rest of Eurasia. And therefore, we are focusing today on connectivity, as you mentioned, through Bangladesh, Myanmar, road connectivity, rail connectivity, unless that connectivity is built. The second thing, you talked about Sagarmala. That's also connectivity. Our ports are so underdeveloped. Our internal connectivity to ports is underdeveloped. Even when a ship arrives at an Indian port, for goods to move inland takes so much time. So it's connectivity across the board which is central to the movement forward.
Right. I mean, just briefly, the Sagarmala project, I'm told it is eventually going to give benefit to more than 70 projects and leading to something like $60 billion worth of activity that will further add to the economic pie, and India itself would probably, or India and some of its neighboring countries could save over $6 billion in terms of the trade-related activities that will come out.
Absolutely. I think this is a great project. Although I have my own view on the technical bit of it is that I think we could do with far fewer ports but larger ports. So I am a little skeptical of having this very large number of scattered ports, because then it's very difficult to build infrastructure for it. But as a general strategy, I mean, never mind the tactics of it, but as a general strategy, absolutely, our ports are absurdly small and inefficient.
Right.
And we are here in Singapore. A very large part of the stuff being dealt by the Singapore port is really transshipment, basically rearranging boxes on ships heading in and out of India.
Right. Well, on that note, and the fact that the Indian Ocean will continue to be the center of geopolitical attention for the next few decades, and the fact that India could play a pivotal role in the region is now very clearly being understood in New Delhi. But we'll be back with another episode on another week. Until then, thank you very much, sir, for being with us on this show. Goodbye.